Hey everybody, Papa Dennis here with another Logic Pro 10 tutorial video. I wanted to just cover a couple more things. So what I've got here is I loaded into this Logic Pro 10 project a song I recorded a couple of years ago and mixed down and everything. It's called Velas, an old Toots Thieleman's song that he played. I think it was probably produced by Quincy Jones. Very pretty song. And I'm going to talk about compression in this video, and then after compression I'm going to talk about how to enhance the stereo spread, make the sound stage wider, make your mixes feel bigger. And so here's how Velas sounds. Again, this has been mastered somewhat, not heavily compressed, but it's somewhat compressed, and a little bit of it. Okay, yeah, it was a beautiful song done by Toots. Toots was a harmonica player, very fine. He played on many recordings. He did a lot of work with Quincy Jones and many other artists. Let's talk about compression. I'm going to open a compressor that I've got on this track. And right now it's turned off. This little switch in the upper left turns it on and off. And I'm going to turn it on. And Logic Pro gives you 7 different compressors, and these are included with Logic Pro 10. And they have different uses. I use the Platinum Digital a lot. I use vintage VCA quite a bit for drums and other things. And I'll give you some brief guidelines that I picked up from established recording engineers about which compressors are best for which types of instruments or vocals. So, but basically they have a lot in common. You'll almost always see a threshold control, which is here, right? Clicking on that, ratio, and something called makeup, which is a gain, a makeup gain. And then you have a knee, you have an attack, and you have a release. Those are your main controls. A nice thing that these Logic Pro 10 compressors have, I think most of them have it, is a limiter over here. And I've got the limiter on. Limiting is, let me talk about compression first, and I'll talk about limiting. If you look at this audio signal up here, you'll see there's peaks and valleys. And the valleys, the low points, are the softest parts of the song, and of course the peaks are the loudest parts. So, and the difference between the lowest valley and the highest peak is known as dynamic range. Compression reduces dynamic range, and it does it by pulling down the peaks, and then after you pull the peaks down, you increase the gain, and I'm doing it down here, to bring everything back up. So the net result is that you've brought the peaks closer to the valleys and reduced dynamic range. And that makes the song sound louder, and it can make it sound fuller if done moderately. So compression's a good thing, but not if it's overdone. And in pop music it's very often overdone, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. So Logic Pro gives you these different types of compressors, and let's talk about the controls briefly. The threshold determines when the compression will kick in, meaning it's a dB level above which the compressor will start to pull down those peaks. And the lower you go with compressor, when I'm going in this direction toward the negative, that's lowering the threshold. So more and more of these peaks are going to be pulled down. The ratio determines how much the peaks are pulled down. Threshold tells it when to start pulling them down, but the ratio determines how much they're going to be pulled down. And for example, a ratio of 5 to 1 means that for every 5 dB the peak is above the threshold, it'll pull it down to 1 dB. So if you're 5 dBs above the threshold, it's going to pull it down to 1. If you're 10 dBs above the threshold, it'll pull it down to 2 dB, 5 to 1. And then makeup. That's what I mentioned earlier. You're pulling down the peaks with compression, which means it will get softer. So you have to compensate for that by cranking up the makeup gain. Okay, makeup gain right here. Oh, and I'll talk about knee. The knee of 0, you see this point here? That's where compression will start, and a knee value set to 0 will have compression kick in immediately. You can soften that by cranking up the knee. So now, I typically use values anywhere from 0.5, sometimes all the way up to 1, very soft knee. It doesn't make a real big difference in my experience for the kind of work that I do. Let's talk about attack briefly. The attack means how quickly will compression work. It's kind of related to knee, but not exactly. Think of instruments like pianos and guitars, where guitar you pluck a string, piano you strike a key. You get an immediate, sharp, loud, transient sound. And if the attack is set to 0, the compressor is going to pull that down based on threshold and ratio, but the compressor will pull it down immediately. If you increase the attack time of the compressor, then it's going to let more of the transient come through. So if you don't want to totally flatten out your piano sounds or your guitar or even bass sounds, then you're going to have your attack at something other than 0. The release is simply how long it will take for the compressor to stop compressing. And again, typical values would be in the 150 to 300 range. Okay, so and we get two different views here. We have a meter and a graph. I tend to use the meter because I like to watch this setting. And my rule of thumb is I don't like to have the compression going too much beyond -10, or certainly not beyond -20. That's typically going to be over-compressing. Now, let's look at what happens if you do over-compress. What I did was I applied a very high amount of compression to this track, the original, and then I bounced it out to another track. So here's that same song that's been overcompressed and limited. I'll talk about limiting in a minute, but it's been overcompressed and limited to the point of it's going to sound bad. And here's what it sounds like. Yeah, so it's obviously louder, but also there's clearly audible distortion in there. It's just very. Yeah, so too much compression, bad thing. Let's look at some pop music. Here is Taylor Swift's song Style. Let's solo her track, turn this track off. And you can see it starts off soft because you have the soft intro, and then so this part of the song is moderately compressed, but then it gets even more compressed when you get to the middle of the song. You got that daydream look in your eye. So that's a very heavily compressed pop tune, and they do that because when the songs are played on the radio or the internet radio, the louder your song can be, the more people are going to notice it. So recording engineers over the last several decades started using too much compression, in my opinion, because they wanted their songs to be louder than everybody else's, and not a good trend. Here's Bruno Mars, 24K Magic. Not as bad as the Taylor Swift tune.
Keep up. So many pretty girls around me and they're waking up the rocket. Keep up.
Yeah, so that's fairly heavily compressed, Bruno Mars. And finally, I got another one loaded here. It's a Meghan Trainor song called No Excuses, right down here. And very heavily compressed. So if I solo her track, and let's play it from here. Let me just mention limiting. The compressors that you get with Logic Pro 10, most of them have a built-in limiter, which is a nice feature. Limiting is like compression, only instead of pulling down the peaks in the audio, it absolutely limits the peaks to 0 dB, or to whatever you set it to. So if you turn it on, and if I set this to minus 0.2 dB, then anytime a peak wants to go above minus 2 dB, it's going to be attenuated. There are standalone limiters that do the same thing, but it's kind of nice to have it built into the compressor, and I typically will use it. Let's talk briefly about what some of these different types are good for, and this information I've gotten from experienced recording engineers, which I am not. But for example, the vintage VCA compressor, it's good for vocals, and you'll want fairly low ratios and slow attacks, and it's also good for bass guitars, and it can be used to increase the mid-range of the bass using a high ratio, like 20 to 1 perhaps. The optical compressors, and here's vintage Opto, they're also good. They're good for bass, vocals, guitars, but they're not good for quick transients. So not good for taming pianos and guitars, the attack of pianos and guitars. FET compressors, like we have two of them here. We've got Studio FET and Vintage FET. They have a very colored sound, according to recording engineers, not transparent, very fast attack and release, and they're recommended for vocals and pianos. I stick with these two mostly. I like the clean sound of the Platinum Digital, and I think I use the Vintage VCA for drums. The others, not so much. Okay, that's it for compression. Next, I want to talk about ways of increasing the stereo spread, making your mixes sound wider. And I've got 4 plugins in this first track, this Velas. I'm going to solo that again. Yeah, I've got 4 plugins, and right now they're turned off. I'll tell you what they are in a minute. So I'm going to put them across the screen down here, and they're all turned off, but I'm going to turn them on one at a time, and you'll listen to the differences. So 4 different ways of increasing your stereo spread, widening the stereo field. Usually I use this one or this one, but the other 2 are viable options. So let's listen to them one at a time. The first one's called Gain, and I'm going to play the song, and then I'll turn this guy on and off. So initially it's off, and now on. To get this to widen the stereo field, you invert one of the channels, either left or right. I'm going to play it and then turn it on. So you're ready, set, go. So now it's on, off, on. Yeah, so it's subtle, but it definitely gives you a wider stereo field. Next, so let's get rid of this guy. He's turned off, so he's not doing anything. Next, this guy, sample delay. Yeah, this one you can, again, you have left and right controls, and you want to apply some kind of a delay to one side of the stereo field. I arbitrarily picked the left side. In practice, it doesn't really matter which way you go, delaying the left or the right. You're going to get a similar result. Ready, set, go. Okay, now it's on. Off. And on. Yeah, these are subtle, and I think you don't really want to overdo this. Subtlety is good. Okay, next we have, this guy's called stereo spread. Well, that's pretty obvious, and you can control the upper. So I think initially it's going to default to something like this, and you can decrease or increase what they call the order. I typically use it with the highest setting on order, and I'm going to play and then turn it on with this. This is an extreme setting, okay? Now it's on and off. Okay. On. So that one's a little more dramatic. You can really hear that. And by the way, you'll hear these effects better if you listen to this video with headphones. Now, typically, you don't want to apply stereo spread to the lower frequencies, so I'm in the habit of moving this up to somewhere around the 400 or 500 hertz point, and cutting this back a little bit. Again, because I don't like it to be too heavy. And let's listen to it. So that's nice. It's a subtle widening of the stereo field. And finally, we have this one called direction mixer. And it's got a spread control here, which starts out at right here, 1.00, which basically does nothing. And then if you want to increase your spread, you just pull this out. And I'm going to put it out maybe around 1.5. And let's listen to it. Now this one will lower the volume a little bit when you increase the spread, and you'll want to compensate for that by applying some gain after the plug-in. Let's listen to it again. And I'm gonna leave it on, and I'll increase the spread as the song progresses, and see if you can hear it. See if you can hear it getting more of a stereo spread. Ready, go. Yeah, it's fairly subtle, but it's nice. It's not a bad way to go. I'll mention one more thing, and then that'll be the end of this video. Well, first of all, the order of your plugins, if you look over here in the lower left, the order of the plugins means something. You definitely want to have a certain order of plugins, and typically compression is going to be the last thing. Channel EQ I have on this track, and I actually increased the bass a little bit on this track because the bass was a little softer than I would like, but yeah, so the order of plugins matters. Compression typically is going to be the last thing. So think of the audio signal coming in from the top down, coming in the top and flowing down and out the bottom. So in this case, the compressor is the last thing that the audio is going to hit on its way out. We'll leave it right there, and thanks for watching, everybody. Bye.